Hmm.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just about 2 minutes. So just sit back and relax, and we'll be with you in just a moment. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started today. It's good to see all of you back for our final session with the Nonprofit Finance Fund. Michael, it's been about 12 weeks, 13 weeks, something like that. I think we started this March 30th. You were
Oh my
with us.
gosh.
So it's pretty wild, but we are here for the very end, talking about putting all of this stuff together, everything that we've kind of talked about through these past months, and telling your financial story, what it's all about. For those that don't know me, my name is Michael Ibrahim, Program Manager here at the Mass Cultural Council. Our focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations, and we're really excited to present this final webinar with the Nonprofit Finance Fund. This webinar is right here at the end of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew series to help organizations come back from COVID-19. All told, it's been 45 webinars that we've been doing this spring. We're wrapping up this Thursday and next Tuesday, all with Mass Creative, when we're talking about advocacy, both at the local, the state, and the federal level, advocacy for arts and culture. So that's how we're going to wrap up our series. But we've had quite a bit. Joining us today is Michael Cass from the Nonprofit Finance Fund. Michael started us off on this journey with NFF back in March, so we're super excited to bring us back all together. Just a few ground rules as we get going. If you want to say hi in the chat, just to give a little wave, that would be great. We have automatic captioning. If you've attended a webinar or meeting with us, you're no stranger to this. We have these at automatic captioning at all webinars and meetings with Mass Cultural Council. You can hide them if you find it distracting by using your closed captioning options at the bottom of Zoom, but you have it available if you need it. We will have questions, time for questions and answers. Michael loves the Q&A function, as do I, so feel free to pop those in. The great thing about the Q&A is you can always be anonymous. So if you don't want to identify yourself or identify your organization, you can always check that box to be anonymous and present your question that way. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Mass Cultural Council YouTube channel, where you can watch pretty much all 45. There's some that we didn't record for sensitivity issues, but pretty much every webinar that we've done this spring are all available on the Mass Cultural Council YouTube channel. This session does run for an hour, and I just put in the link a moment ago for our presentation. So if you'd like to follow along at home using a PDF of this presentation, you've got that. I'll put it up there again for those of you who just joined us. And so with that, I'd love to turn it over to Michael.
Thank you so much, Michael. And hello, everybody. Welcome. Like Michael said, this is the end of the NFF part of this program, this project. And today we're going to be weaving all of the pieces from the past 12 weeks together into something we call telling your financial story. So as always, before we get started, there we go. Just taking a moment to do a land acknowledgement, to acknowledge the history and the stories of the territories that we're joining from. I want to read this quote from Northwestern University, because I think for this workshop in particular, it's really important to realize that the stories we're telling, financial or otherwise, exist in a larger context. And that when we recognize the land as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It's important to understand the long-standing history that's brought you to reside on the land, and to seek to understand your place within that history. And you'll see, Michael, thank you for dropping that link in, native-land.ca. So wherever you are, I'm guessing you're in Massachusetts or nearby, that you can just check. And if you want to put into the chat an acknowledgement of the peoples whose land you're on. So I am on and facilitating today from the traditional lands of the Apache and Pueblo peoples. Today it's known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it is an honor to be here with you today. So I'm going to take a nice slow breath into that just to prepare ourselves for the story that's about to unfold. And if you want to join me, you can. So just going to breathe in and release, with that intention of just honoring and expressing gratitude to the ancestral peoples of the land. By now, this is old hat. I am a consultant with Nonprofit Finance Funds. One thing that I want to mention that's pertinent to today's workshop is that all of this work that we do today, the trusted partnerships, investing, financial education, is not what NFF started as. We started as a very small niche organization supporting, thank you so much for adding that in and honoring the Agawam peoples to us. So NFF started with a very narrow scope, and as time went on, our business model changed. So now we offer a much wider scope, and every time our business model change, every time our services change, we needed a new financial story. And the same is true of us as organizations. So what we'll be talking about today isn't necessarily how to talk about your budget, but how to tell the story of your organization through the lens of finance. A few agreements to build on what Michael said. All of our experiences are valid. Some of us are already super comfortable communicating with our board, our staff, other stakeholders around our financial stories. Some of us are not. So as you have questions, as things come up, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A. And I've got the Q&A open on the side of my screen, and I'll catch it. If I don't, Michael will. Today, we really have three goals. The first is, before we can even tell our financial story, we generally have to make decisions to talk about. So we'll be talking about how do we use data, not just financial data, but other data as well, to facilitate powerful strategic conversations, both internally, maybe even with ourselves, also with our board, with funders, with staff members. Then we'll explore the components of powerful financial stories and how to put those components together. And then we'll talk about how we tailor these stories for different audiences. There is no such thing as a single story that will meet the needs of every single audience. So we'll be looking at some strategies to help you tailor those stories. We'll start out again by just looking at how do we make decisions. And this tool that you see in front of you is a really powerful way to separate out the elements that are involved in making complex decisions. And I'll walk you through this tool, and we'll look at one scenario that an organization put through this tool and the decision that they made. So on the left, you have the different criteria that you can use to evaluate the impact that a decision will have, right? For this organization, they've decided to look at how it will impact their mission, how a decision will impact their staffing, how soon that impact will take place, which is the time horizon, risks associated with the decision, and the financial impact of the decision, right? So for this organization, they were an organization or are an organization that serves youth with sports, arts, and other programming. And at the beginning of the pandemic last year, they had a tough decision to make. One of the scenarios they were looking at was, do we pivot our programming and create a new online program for youth? Right? There's a lot of complexity in making that decision. So when they put it into this tool, they discovered that the mission impact would be both positive and high. This activity was highly aligned with their mission, and it would enable them to stay connected with their students. So that's great, positive, high impact. The staffing impact would be minimal. They would neither lose staff, nor would they have to bring on new staff. They would be able to use existing staff and their capacity to provide this programming. The time horizon would be immediate for fall implementation, right? This conversation was happening in the spring and early summer, right about almost exactly a year ago, and they would see immediate impact. And the risks would be low. And it's really important to look at why the risks are low here. It's not just because it's easy to make online programs, as most of us have discovered over the past year. It's actually quite difficult, but it was because they already had experience in the design and implementation of online programs. The risk was low because they already have the curriculum built out and they have funding identified. So although there would be startup costs, they already knew where the money was coming from. And because of that, the financial impact was neutral, right? That $5,000 in startup costs was already committed and their teachers' salaries were already in the budget, right? So that was their analysis of this scenario of pivoting to an online program for youth. The other scenario they were looking at was pausing youth sports programs altogether during the pandemic. So not just not in person, but also not doing it online. The mission impact here would be highly negative because that program is core to their mission, right? The staffing impact would be moderate because it would affect 4 staff. In this case, that pause would mean those 4 staff either going to part-time or losing their employment altogether. The time horizon would also be immediate. This is something that would affect them within a few months. And again here, the risks of this are low. And the reason that the risks are low is that the peer programs were also pausing, right? Nobody was continuing in-person programs last year, and their funders were supporting general operating support, meaning if they were to pause the youth sports program, there was no funding tied directly to that. The funding was could be repurposed for other operating expenses. And many of these families were already in an alternative program, so they wouldn't necessarily wholly lose connection with those kids and their families. Now, the financial impact here is not neutral. They had moderate savings. They would save 10% of their overall budget, and it would be more costly to deliver it in fiscal year 2021, right? So those moderate savings could be really important for this organization. If we look at this on the surface, it seems like the decision is pretty clear, right? It looks like from this analysis that the decision would be, oh, let's create this new online program for youth. It's got a positive impact, minimal impact on staff, low risks, neutral budget impact. Now, what we don't know for this organization is how important this 10% savings is. If this is an organization that is in financial distress and financial crisis, then it may be that the decision that would make the most sense for them would be to pause youth sports programs, right? If they need that money to ensure the long-term success of their mission, right? In this case, that wasn't the case with this organization, and they made the decision to implement a new online program for youth. But this goes to point out that no matter what criteria we use, and if you use this tool, you can create whatever criteria make the most sense for your decision-making process. But any decision is going to come with trade-offs. Nothing is perfect. So it's really important when making decisions that you and your board and your staff and other stakeholders make sure that you all understand what your organization's priorities are. If you really need those financial savings, that may take precedence over the impact on the staff. And these are not easy decisions. It's just important to, as we all know, just accept that there is no perfect decision, in many of these cases. And we'll want to iterate on this, particularly now as many of our organizations are reopening in different ways, and there may have been pandemic-specific funding that came through, and we don't know if it's coming through next year or not. Being able to iterate on this analysis is really important. I want to give an example of a situation where an organization recently used this and was really blown away at how effective it was. I think it was 2 weeks ago. Was consulting with an organization in, I want to say Pennsylvania, and they were grappling with 3 very different scenarios, all of which were very complex. And not only grappling with it, this executive director in her own mind, but also how to communicate it to the board. There were too many variables floating around. So we sat and came up with criteria that were slightly different than these that you see on the left, but not that different, for each of the scenarios, and just put them through a high-level analysis. And so for each of the 3 scenarios, she was able to really crystallize what the impact on each of those criteria would be. And then she was able to use that, not just to achieve greater clarity in her own thinking, but to communicate with the board. And it was an incredibly productive conversation, right? Without tools like this, and many of the other tools we've introduced over the last 12 weeks, there's so much information and so many variables that our heads can swim. So the hope is that we can leverage these tools to make our lives a little bit easier and to give structure in situations that are incredibly complex. It's also really important to acknowledge that decision-making in times of crisis, particularly in times of crisis, but really any time, can have really high stakes. And when we have high stakes, we have high emotions because we're human and we care about our work. We care about the communities we serve. We care about the people we work with. So it's really important often to simply acknowledge that that emotion is real and that everyone is interested in a harmonious, positive outcome for this situation. And sometimes it's simply enough to say, hey, before we go into this conversation, it's really powerful to acknowledge that this is going to bring up emotions for a lot of us, and that's okay, right? These are not clinical, solely numbers-based decisions. And as part of that, it's important that everybody in the room understand what their role is, understand what the impact of any decision will have on them, right? The board, the management, the staff, even sometimes clients, depending on the kind of work you do. If possible, agreeing on the goal, agreeing on that priority, right? And that might look like a conversation that ends with, okay, so we're agreed that our #1 priority right now is ensuring the financial well-being of the organization. And then secondary is to make sure that we maintain mission critical programming at the current levels, right? That can be difficult to agree on. So sometimes it can be just as powerful to agree on our guide rails, right? Guide rails might be things like, we're going to have a conversation for 2 hours, and by the end of that 2 hours, here's what we want to have accomplished, right? Just to make sure that everybody is rowing in the same direction. And sometimes, especially when emotions are running high, a decision may seem like the right one. The invitation is always to slow down for a moment if you can and sleep on it and come back at it with fresh eyes the next day, right? Again, the idea that we're inviting in here is that these financial decisions aren't just financial, right? The stories we tell about them aren't just financial. It's also about our mission and our values, our programs and our people. Which brings us to storytelling. Unlike data, which is very linear, storytelling can encompass complexity, different points of view, and a lot of variables in a way that doesn't just convey information, but also conveys emotion and commitment and passion. One of the things that I love about story is that if we drill down on it a little bit, it really is the basic building block of community. And any time that we are communicating our financial story or our organizational story or impact stories, at some level, what we're working on is building a sense of community and commitment around our organization's work and mission, right? And story is able to, because it's the basic building block of community, is able to facilitate that much more effectively than data alone, right? So that's storytelling in general. Financial storytelling is simply that through the lens of finance, right? As we've said a couple of times, the idea here isn't that we're creating a budget narrative, but that we're helping people understand, and maybe even helping ourselves understand, the inextricable link between our financial realities, our financial history, where we are now and where we'd like to be financially, and the work that we do, our impact on the communities that we serve. So the idea is that we'd like these financial stories to really weave together the financial situation we're in and decisions we've made with our core values and our mission and our vision, right? Now, sometimes we may find that our financial decisions, for whatever reason, have gotten out of whack. They've gotten out of alignment with our values, mission, and vision. And so in those cases, the opportunity is to explain how and why that happened, and maybe what steps you're taking to bring those into alignment. I'll pause there just to breathe and let you digest a little bit, see if there's any questions so far, because we are now going to look at all of the components that we put together in our financial stories before we go on to looking at some templates and how we might assemble these stories for different audiences. All right, here we go. When it comes to financial storytelling, there's really 3 financial stories that we can tell. And these roughly line up to past, present, and future, right? In the past, we have our trends, meaning what happened in the past. And especially now, there may be 2 trends. There may be the trends, the business model trends of our organization and our work before 2020, during 2020, because there were so many shifts, right? How did we respond to what happened? And then what was the effect we were aiming for with that response, right? What were we trying to do as we pivoted and shifted our financial model, maybe, or maybe our work? So that's the past. In the present, we look at the story of our business model. Today, now, how do we make and spend money in support of our work? And how does our audience, whoever they may be, fit into this business model, right? Because the way that our staff fits into the business model is very different than the way our board of directors or our major contributors may fit into the business model, right? And so the story will want to be slightly different for each of those audiences. So that's the present. And then the future is the evolution of our story. Where do we see ourselves going, or where would we like to be going? How is our organization, our work, and our business model evolving together? And what do we need to realize the vision from the future? How can the community that you're speaking to or communicating with be a part of realizing the evolution of your organization's work? So let's go down one level deeper and look at where information for each of these 3 stories comes from. So once again, looking at the past, we're looking at those trends, and key questions might be, well, what have been the biggest events or changes, positive or challenging, in the past couple of years? And what's the effect of those events been on our financial health, right? Those are the key questions we want to look at for the past. And for that, we'll get data from our past income statements and past balance sheets, right? We'll look at what those trends have been over time. Looking at the present, the key questions we might look at are, well, what's our current business model? How are we operating now? Where is revenue coming from? And where are we spending money? How have we addressed COVID-19? How has physical distancing impacted us? How has the social upheaval of the past year maybe impacted us, right? And for those questions, again, we look at our current and revised budget that tell us how we're doing, our budget versus actual numbers, right? What did we plan versus where we are? We look at our cash flow projections, which tell us quite literally how much cash we have in the bank and how much cash is coming into the organization and leaving the organization on a periodic basis. And we'll look at our most recent balance sheet, because again, a balance sheet is like a snapshot in time of how our organization is doing financially, how much we own, which is our assets, versus how much we owe, which is our liabilities. So that's the present. And then we look into the future, 3, 6, 9 months, if you can see this far out, maybe even a year. What are our future needs? And how will changes affect our income statement or balance sheet, right? Where do we see things headed? And sometimes, particularly when we're beset with uncertainty and there's a lot of variables at play, these can be hard questions to answer. So to try to answer them, we're going to look at our future projected budgets. We're going to look at our scenario budgets, of which there may be many right now, right? So these are the 3 questions, or the 3 elements of a financial story, and where we get the data. And then the challenge is putting them together in a way that makes sense and is compelling and gets your audience from where they are at the beginning of the story to where you want them to be at the end of the story. In order to do that, it's really important that we know our audiences. And there's really 2 big buckets of audience that we have in our financial stories, and organizational storytelling in general, for that matter. The first is our internal audience. This is our board, our staff, our volunteers, the people we serve. And the idea for internal audiences might be to focus them on priorities. When we communicate early and often and transparently with our board, with our staff about our financial story, it can transform our culture and practice. Sometimes in organizations, I remember being on staff at several organizations where, although I knew what the budget was and I had access to financial documents, I didn't really know where the organization was at with all that at any given moment. And I remember back in 2008, that became really problematic and created some distrust of the management, because we simply was like, this data was happening in a little black box and we had no idea where these decisions were coming from, right? And so the confidence in management decreased. That could have been helped so much by really transparent communication, even if the content of that communication was often, honestly, everyone, we don't know what the future holds. There's a lot of uncertainty. Here's where we are right now. Can make a huge difference. So that's one bucket. The second bucket is external audiences, our clients, our funders, and our partners, right? Here we may want to demonstrate need and context, right? Not just getting everyone on the same page, but making sure that our audience understands the broader realities within which we're working. It can support reporting and compliance if you have government grants or any other grants. We simply need to tell our financial story in order to comply with the conditions of the grants. And then again, increasing confidence in management. Again, just a quick story about this. Almost, my gosh, it's been over a decade now. I was working with an organization that was doing fine financially until they weren't. And things at first, they thought they could pull themselves out of this sort of financial mismanagement situation without letting anybody know. And then it got really, really, really bad. And so we had to make really challenging, difficult phone calls to funders, letting them know what the situation had grown into and asking for their forbearance, asking for their help. Some of the foundations were very responsive and understood, but maybe a third of them, their first question was, why didn't you tell us sooner, right? By not communicating that financial story transparently and early, it had been a breach of trust with them. And so they were less willing to invest in the mission because they did not trust our management. To go a little bit deeper into this, another way of looking at it is, what are the conversations we're having with these different audiences? What questions are we asking? What are we being asked? What are folks wanting from us, right? So for funders, for example, funders really, at least many of the ones I've spoken to, want to understand how what's going on in the world is impacting our work, is impacting the way that we run our business. And they have no way of knowing that unless we tell them. So our financial stories might be about helping them get a greater sense of the context that we're operating inside of, right? And what needs we have in order to navigate that context. When we're talking to our board, they want to be helpful, but sometimes there's too much information or not enough information. So we want to help focus their attention with our financial decision making. We might want to discuss how to use reserves or debt to support our needs. Especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember working with at least 5 different boards who their organizations had reserves, and the executive director and leadership team wanted to access those reserves to help weather the crisis. And the board resisted because they didn't understand that this was the rainy day that they'd been saving for. And so the financial storytelling and organizational storytelling helped create the context to help them facilitate that conversation. We also, in talking to our staff, we may want to talk about how our financial story is going to impact them personally and professionally. Again, we want to keep everyone up to date on response and recovery efforts, let them know how they can help, let them know exactly what's going on as much as we can. Now, in situations with the staff, a question that's come up sometimes is, well, there's so much uncertainty. I don't want to just communicate to them all the time. We have no idea what's going on. We don't know what's going on. There's always something that you do know, even if it's something small, right? You know that you have a budget, right? You know that probably for the next week at least, you know what programs you're going to have. And now we're starting to get a little bit longer insight. So the invitation there is always to start with what you do know, even if it's a little, and not give in to the temptation to throw up your hands and like, we don't know what's going on. Just be patient with us. As frustrating as it may be for you as an organizational leader or communicator, it's even more frustrating for the folks who are on the receiving end of that story. And in talking with our community and our partners, maybe look at how our services, our collaboration, our work might want to shapeshift to respond to the community needs, to respond to the constantly shifting and evolving realities that we may find ourselves in. So all of these are really great ideas. Let's look at a concrete tool to really help us understand our audiences a little better. And we've got time. I'll give you a chance to practice this if you want to. This is a terrible name for a powerful tool. It's called the From, To, Think, Do matrix. And here's how it works. You can see it's a simple quadrant chart or a table. At the top, we have from, which means where is your audience at before you speak with them, before you communicate with them. And on the right, we have to, which is where you want them to be after hearing or reading or seeing your story, right after the conversation with you. At the top left, we have think, which means what is their mindset? What are their beliefs? And at the bottom, we have do, which is what action are they taking or not taking? So the way it works is in the upper left, for whatever your chosen audience is, you write for that audience, what are they thinking before you speak with them? What do they believe about your work, about your financial reality, about your business model? And as a result of those thoughts and what they're thinking, what are they doing or not doing? And we'll look at an example of this in a moment. And then on the other side, over here on the right, where do we want them to end up? How do we want their thinking, their mindset to shift as a result of the story we tell? And what do we want them to do as a result of that shift? This, by the way, is great, not just for financial storytelling, but for any communication, because one of the things that happens when we're so passionate about our work is when we communicate with people, we have the mistaken assumption that they are looking at the situation through the same lens that we are. And as a result, we're not meeting them where they are. And effective storytelling, especially effective financial storytelling, wants to meet people on the left side of this chart, where they're coming from, and build a bridge through the financial story to where we want them to be. So let's look at what this might look like. So the audience here is a foundation that had supported an organization with general operating support for many years, for I think it was almost a decade. And this is a real life example. And the communicator was the director of development who had received a rejection letter and was like, what has happened? And the head of the foundation called and apologized and said, hey, I'm so sorry that we aren't able to support you this year, but our board has a mandate, like a rule, that we will not fund an organization that has more than 6 months of reserves in the bank. Because if you have that much money in the bank, you obviously don't need our support, right? So that's where they're starting from. They're thinking that if an organization has this much money in reserves, it does not need grant support. And as a result, they said no to a grant after all of these years of saying yes, of supporting them. So in the financial story being told, here's the mindset shift that the organization, the director of development, needed to facilitate, right? To understand that those reserves, those 6 months of reserves, functioned as an internal line of credit during cash flow dips throughout the year. And here's why that's important. This organization was 100% privately funded, and they had 4 fundraising periods throughout the year, right? That roughly coincided with the seasons. So when their audit was taken, which is where the foundation had gotten this information, their balance sheet, their financial snapshot was right after a huge fundraising period at the end of the calendar year, right? The holiday period. And so that period had made that organization really flush with cash. But because of the way their business model operated, they knew that over the next 3 months, there would be very little money coming in, and they would need to draw down on those reserves. So if the audit had been done in like early March, right before spring, they would see that there were maybe 2 months of reserves in the bank, right? So the story wanted to be about, hey, here's our business model. Here's why our balance sheet looks the way it does. And with that understanding, what they wanted the foundation to do was reconsider their decision and approve a grant. And even more broadly, revisit their foundation giving policies, right? To really acknowledge, hey, that assumption we made about the amount of money you have in the bank, that might not be valid and probably isn't valid for all organizations. And that no two nonprofits really have the same business model. So we may need to look at this on a case-by-case basis and invite people to tell their financial story. So this story has a happy ending. The foundation was extremely understanding, and they did approve partially that grant for that year, but then approve them in many years going forward. And they did change the giving policies of the foundation. So this is a powerful example of how financial storytelling can also be advocacy, can also help build understanding of the actual realities within which we work. So I want to pause there and give you the chance to play with this, because conceptually it's pretty simple. But I've noticed that when people go through this exercise for one of your own audiences, it can get sometimes a little bit confusing. So I'm going to pause and stop talking for like 2 or 3 minutes. And what I'd encourage you to do is pick an audience. It can be your board, a funder, even staff, and go through this exercise with them, right? So draw these quadrants. And then for that audience, where are they starting from? Where are they now? And where do you want them to end up? And as you go through, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or into the Q&A. We'll just take maybe another couple moments for this. Great. And we'll move on. So if you have any questions or you had any aha moments, which sometimes happens with this, you can put them in the chat or just chat me directly by chatting to the panelists. If you have any questions and you don't want everybody to see the chat, or you can also use the Q&A. So now we know our audience. We know the journey that we want our audience to take. So let's look at, this to side. Let me go back for one moment. The to side, what we want them to do might not always be money, right? So there are a lot of different calls to action. Sometimes, especially in the last year, we needed skills. We needed people who knew how to create online curriculum, for example, or could help set people up on Zoom or other communication tools for online outlets. We might be asking for relationships or reputation, data, understanding, and then also financial support. And when we are asking for financial support, that ask, and we'll see this in the examples we'll look at in a moment, always wants to be specific, meaningful, and actionable so that people understand how much you're asking for, right? And how it's going to be useful, not just to your financial bottom line, but also to moving your mission forward. So here's how we put all the pieces together. It's a winding road, but actually the process is pretty linear. The first thing that we're going to do is always lead with our mission, right? Don't lead with the financial stuff, because people don't support us because they care about our bottom line. Generally, that's not the case. They support us and they're part of our community, part of our organization, because they believe in what we're doing. And this is true of board members and staff and funders alike, right? So we always want to lead with context, lead with our mission and the work that we do. Again, this is something that we may take for granted, but the folks we're speaking to might not. Then we want to talk about what happened. What was the trend, right? What was the event that made it necessary for us to reach out? How did we respond to that event? How did we pivot, move, shift? What was the effect of that response, right? What has happened since we responded? And then finally, what do we need, right? What is the ask? What's the call to action? So let's look at a few examples of what this might look like for different audiences. The first example is a funder. And what we're asking for is flexibility in funding. In this case, the funder gave a restricted grant, and the organization is asking them to unrestrict those funds to be used for general operating support. So let's look at how it works, right? First, we lead with the mission. This was written in 2020, and the first thing they do is say, since 2000, when we were founded, 2 decades, awesome organization, has demonstrated improvements in classroom behavior and attendance through arts and cultural programming during school. We've also successfully advocated for more public spaces and transformed the corridor, right? Transformed the whole neighborhood. So right away, what they're establishing is we are a cornerstone of this cultural community, doing much more than just working in the schools. We've actually helped change this whole area. So now we get to what happened. At the beginning of COVID-19, closures interrupted our programs. So we had to cancel our gala as well. And as a result, we lost 50% of our revenue, right? This is potentially disastrous for the organization. So the next thing we're going to see is what the response was. So our education programs are now online. We pivoted. We translated COVID-19 materials for local communities to make them more accessible. And those gala attendees, we asked them to convert their advanced commitments into donations and have changed it into a giving drive. So although we can't do the gala, we're not just giving up, we're finding other fundraising opportunities. And that closed the gap by 25%. And in addition, they secured a PPP loan. So what's the effect of all of this been? Now we're on number 4. As a result of this, we've deepened our connections to the community. But without this, without our PPP loan and giving drive, we would have had to reduce our operations by at least a half. We wouldn't have been able to pivot quickly. And now we start to move to the call to action. Even now, the restrictions we have on our grants are making it challenging for us to consider necessary adaptations to the way we work. And now, finally, after all of that context and making it clear that they've done all they can on their own without assistance, we get to the ask. Given this uncertainty, we need flexibility in our funding. Can you release the restrictions on this grant? Based on what we know right now, that will allow us to meet safety guidelines and deliver that program, right? A different version of this might have started with the ask. Hello, I'm reaching out today to ask you to release restrictions on the grant we needed in order to continue programming. Provokes more questions than answers and makes it hard for the foundation to say yes to our request. At one level, a financial story like this, its job is to make it easy to say yes, to lead the audience, in this case, a foundation, to a really solid understanding of where we've been, where we are, and how they can help support us going forward, right? So we're going to look at this same organization with a completely different audience. Here's what this might look like for our board. And for the board, we're not looking for flexibility on funding. What we're looking for is introductions, relationships, input, and financial contributions. So let's look at how they do this. Number one is exactly the same, right? Word for word, since 2000, et cetera. What happened? Nothing has changed. Our COVID closure is the same, 50% loss in revenue is the same. And even the response here, the way we talk about the response is the same. Where it starts to change, because the board needs different information than the foundations, is what the effect was on the mission, right? We've deepened connections to our community. We're having good conversations about the future. And now we go into a more detailed financial analysis. Based on our worst case scenario, we're looking at a cash flow gap of $50,000 in November. Our year-end giving should put us back on track to manage cash flow, and we're making a bigger push this year, right? So notice that they make it really clear, first of all, what the specific anticipated cash flow gap might be. And they also make it clear that this is a cash flow challenge, not a cash issue, right? Remembering that a cash flow issue is, hey, we're going to be short. We know money is coming in the future. And a cash issue is we're going to be short and we don't really know how we're going to make up the difference. So with that context, they have a very specific ask, which is a multi-pronged approach. One, do you know any connections, anyone at banks that can help us apply for a line of credit, which would be like really beneficial strategic debt because they know they'll be able to pay it back. Then, if not, or even if so, could you increase or expedite your year-end giving to October, right? Meaning not necessarily asking for new funds, but saying, hey, you've already committed these gifts. Can you expedite it so that we don't have this cash flow crunch for a few months? And finally, do you have any other suggestions, right? Looking at this situation, is there anything else you might be able to suggest, right? So we start to see how we have the exact same situation, same organization, and how the financial story and the information we put into it and the ask we make starts to shift according to the audience. We'll look at one more example, same organization, same situation. And this is staff, right? In this case, we're asking our staff to take a really specific action. And specifically, this is a fundraising staff member. So again, we're leading with our mission, exactly the same. What happened is exactly the same. Our response is exactly the same. And again, we start to see how we customize it for the audience in number 4, the effect on our mission. Your quick actions as a staff helped us deepen our community relationships. It helped us avoid drastic reductions. And as a result, I think we've actually gotten closer as a team. I've had great ideas from you and appreciate how adaptable you've been, right? So we're starting with information and then gratitude, really appreciating the understanding and flexibility of the staff. And now we get to the ask, right? We need the foundation to release restrictions on a grant. Could you please share the budget progress to date for the program based on what we know today? And then making it clear what the implications of not getting those funds released from restriction will be. We might need to give some of those funds back or not even be able to spend it until next year. It's going to help with scenario planning. I love including this example because as a former fundraising person for organizations, I can't tell you how many times a leadership person, sometimes an executive director, would like run into my office and say, in 10 minutes, I need the report for this program. I need the budget versus actual. I need all this information without telling me why. And probably not understanding that getting those reports was not as simple as pressing a button. It actually required a few different people to pull information from different places. And from my point of view, as the fundraising person, it made me kind of resentful because I had other priorities as well. Communicating some version of this, maybe not all of the context, but some version of this, starting with gratitude, helping me understand the context, would have gone a long way to helping me understand how important that information was and how to prioritize it on my ever-growing list of things to get done, right? So again, same organization, same situation, different audience, different implications. And again, this starts with assembling your information and then doing your audience analysis and then following these steps for your financial story. So zooming back out, right? The invitation with all of this financial storytelling is to communicate early and often. I think throughout this series, we've been talking about owning your numbers as much as you can and building comfort over time with reporting with some of the tools that we've gone over the past 12 weeks. Keeping a dialogue going between staff, board partners, and constituents about what we know, what we don't know, what our options might be. Often in organizations, right, we don't talk about our budget really. We look at like maybe monthly or quarterly financial reports and then go into a tizzy when it comes time to do our annual budget. The idea is that financial storytelling can really help us keep the conversation going so that these financial processes like budgeting, scenario planning, et cetera, can be a lot less stressful. Staying in front of funders, not pulling back. And it's also really important and powerful, especially right now where we're operating in a new reality that's still emerging, by the way, to share our experiences with our network and stakeholders. I've been facilitating a lot of group coaching conversations with executive directors from different organizations. And one of the values to it isn't just, whatever information that I'm able to provide, but what they're able to provide to each other, not just in terms of guidance, but also, as we talked about earlier, this is emotional stuff often when we're talking about our financial realities. So providing peer and emotional support to each other in addition to best practices and information is really, really powerful in times of change, crisis, or any time, really. And it helps us advocate for more equitable and effective systems and supporting policies. Like in the example where the organization had to communicate with the foundation, it became effective advocacy because by sharing their specific story, they were able to help that foundation understand how their policies were misguided. And to their credit, the foundation was able to own that and adapt and shapeshift accordingly. So let's take a moment, just in the last couple moments, to breathe. There's a lot of information, a lot of approaches today before we close out. And you can just think for yourself or pop it into the chat if that feels interesting to you. Anything you learned from today's session that you can use in your work? Any feelings that came up as we did it? Sometimes with this one, people can feel overwhelmed or can feel a sense of relief because it kind of helps put structure to some of these things that can seem really, really formless sometimes. And any specific actions that you can take back to your organization, specific tools you might be able to use. I'll just pause here for a moment of reflection, letting everything we've gone through together in today's webinar just settle into your minds and bodies. Yeah. Julie, thank you for sharing this. In the chat, Julie is sharing It's helpful to keep finding creative ways to use financials as a tool to tell and enhance our stories. Yeah, I love that, right? A lot of times our organizational storytelling gets pigeonholed into like an impact story, a success story. It's really powerful to add um, a financial organizational storytelling to our universe of options and making that creative and useful. Thanks, Julie. So hopefully you can apply these. And again, that from to think do matrix is so powerful. Maureen is sharing in the chat. The matrix with the terrible name is helpful. And she's feeling good because you've been following some of what you shared intuitively. Yeah, a lot of this one particularly is like, even if it just backs up stuff you're already doing, you're like, oh, great. The nominal experts on this are saying the same thing. We're doing great. So I'm glad that we're aligned on that, Maureen. Thank you. Yeah. So let's move towards closing out, and hopefully you'll continue to reflect, and some of this will be useful as you go forward in your work. This is where we've been, except for our first one, I think is missing, where we talked about communicating with our board. But this is the journey we've been on. Today is telling your financial story, and now it's fireworks time. So whether you've joined for the entire series or just a couple of times, our first of all, we're incredibly grateful that you've taken time out of your work and your incredibly, I'm sure, busy schedules to explore nonprofit finance, which is not always everybody's favorite exploration to embark on. And we really hope that it's been useful, that it's been fruitful, and that these materials have been and continue to be a really powerful addition to your work. And particularly in the way that you bring others into the financial conversations and analysis that drive the business model and engine of your organizations. And with that, a final gratitude, Michael, to you and MCC for hosting this series, and to everybody who's joined over the past 12 weeks. So thank you, everybody, and back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for everyone for attending today. It's been great with all of you at NFF. We've heard 8 or 9 different voices. It's been a wonderful team at NFF, and I think depending on your background, you'd mentioned as a fundraiser or where we come from, we all do this separately. I'm an old development director as well, so we have that kind of angle as we approach this work. So thank you to all of you at NFF, and for everybody, this may have been your first time in this series. I'll just remind you that all of these videos are available at the Mass Cultural Council's YouTube channel, where you could go back and do your own basic financial management certification in arts administration through this work. We're also in the process of building out a capacity building toolkit on the Mass Cultural Council's website, our actual website. So there you can not only watch the videos, but you can also download the presentations, the tools, the handbooks. There's been a lot of templates, particularly with finance, that you could, don't waste your time creating cash flow templates. We already have that for you. So we're going to be building that out, and it'll be available probably in the middle of July. So I have all of your emails since you've registered for this, and we're going to be sending out a big notice when that toolkit is available. And of course, it's not just financial management, it's also board, legal issues. We've talked advocacy, which we will be doing in the next last sessions. I just posted there in the chat. So Emily Ruddick with Mass Creative, many of you probably know Emily. State Arts and Cultural Advocacy Organization is going to be closing out the session Thursday and next Tuesday. Those are the 2 links there on how to organize, strategize, build your advocacy case. And I think it's great here right at the end when we talk about your financial story to talk about, now let's do advocacy. And Michael, you brought both together, the advocacy and the financial there. So thank you everyone for attending today, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Stay safe.
Thank you, everybody.